Hello and good morning, and welcome to our second week of our study, The Freedom of a Christian. And this is actually the third video in our series of conversations. Last week, you were asked to look at the study guide, which is on pages 7 through 18, and the text, paragraphs 18 to 33. Most of our conversation will cover that material today and bridge over a little bit to prep for our conversations next week. So next week, I would like you to read the study guide, pages 19 to 28, study guide, pages 19 to 28, and then in the text itself, I'd like you to read paragraphs 34 to 51. Paragraphs 34 to 51. And therein, Luther talks about the nature of Scripture by which we apprehend the promises and the commands of God. And then he gives a more discursive examination of the nature of faith, speaking about its three powers. So looking ahead a little bit there to next week. These videos are short. We only have about 15 minutes before we hit the maximum of what we can upload. So again, my understanding for these videos is to provide a little bit broader context, kind of look at the overview, and maybe go a little bit deeper into some of the questions that come up. But my assumption is that the study guide and the text are more clear and are going to guide your more regular reading and understanding. But of course, if you have questions or concerns, that's where the Q&A at the bottom of this video is a great opportunity to post some questions. I see Carl posted a question last week, and I thank you for that, and I was able to add a little bit of clarity to what the 6 points of view were in the last video. So let's start here by understanding Martin Luther's view of humanity, because I think if we get this wrong, read through, again, as I mentioned last video, through a post-Enlightenment view, we really misunderstand where Luther is coming from. If we read this from a social or political lens, we have misunderstood the thrust or the essence of the theological argument that Luther is making. One can roughly, very simplistically, divide humanity into two views, or more appropriately to say, one can divide views of humanity into one of two camps. The first is to emphasize all that we are able to do in spite of our limitations versus all that we fail to do despite our potential. So again, those are all that we are able to do in spite of our limitations. Think of all the great achievements humanity has made, despite the fact that we are mere mortal creatures and subject to war and famine and pandemic and death. Look at all the great art and music and scientific achievement that humans have done in spite of all that. That's one view. You might call that an optimistic view. The other, depending on your point of view, could be a realistic point of view or it could be a pessimistic point of view. But to say, yes, nonetheless, despite all that we have been able to achieve, human nature has still not changed. Not only are we subject to the limitations of the material world, we are petty and vindictive and small-minded creatures. Despite all the art and scientific advancements, we so easily fall into war, to craven behavior, to manipulative and exploitative behavior. So no matter the heights that humanity can achieve, we will always be limited by our self-defeating behavior. Again, whether that's realistic or pessimistic, but I think you can see the two general points of view. Look at all the things we can do, yes, despite the bad things, but nonetheless, we can do great things. And others can look at the same picture and see the other side of the coin and say, yes, even in the midst of all those great things, really we are still very limited, weak, fragile creatures who tend to cause more harm to fellow humans than anything nature can do to us. So given these two understandings of humanity, I think it's fair to put Martin Luther in that second category, certainly theologically speaking, right? That despite all the great things we can do, we always need to be aware of the limitations of human nature and the flaws of human nature, that fundamentally we have to exhibit humility. Humility in the face of what we want to claim humans can do. And in that regard, I think Martin Luther is reflecting, I think fair to say, a biblical point of view. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we get this account of the fall and a sense of humans rejecting that union with God and going for the one thing they think that will make them like God and not need dependence on God. We call that theologically the fall. We know about the struggle of the Israelites in Abraham to maintain the covenant. Sorry, my computer tried to go to sleep there. To maintain the covenant, wandering in the desert, right? So the struggles honestly portrayed of the Jewish people in the Torah. We know about the role of the prophets, right, who constantly have to call and remind people back to the heart or the essence of the law. So there is a kind of, again, I don't know if it's fair to say pessimism, but a sense of awareness that even in the midst of great achievement, this achievement's always very fragile, that in a moment, everything that has taken generations to build could simply come undone by a thoughtless, careless act by a human person or small group of people. This attitude is also reflected in the writings of St. Paul. In our readings for this morning, for Reformation Sunday, we're reading Romans 3, where he speaks about human accountability before the law. And before the law, no one can stand. Everyone is going to be held accountable, and in the accountability of the law, all mouths must be silent. That is, no one has a right to boast or claim their achievements in the face of the majesty and the perfection of God. Finally, the most important theologian, Christian theologian, post-biblical writings, is St. Augustine of Hippo. He's called the Doctor of Grace. He's a mid-4th, early 5th century theologian who really fleshes out this theological view that, again, in terms of human nature, humility before God is what is required. And I think that's maybe the most important distinction here to make, that when we're talking about human achievement, there are one of 2 ways we can do it. To speak, the fancy phrase is coram deo, that is what humanity can achieve or is able to do where humanity stands before God, coram deo, and what humanity is able to do or where humanity stands, coram mundo, that is before the world. So in light of ourselves and what we can do in the achievements, yes, we can talk about the great things that humanity has done. But when humanity looks at itself in light of God and God's will and God's command, coram deo, we become highly aware of our limitations and that nothing we do really is worthy of boasting in the face of God. And that coram deo approach, looking at humanity before God, is the approach of Augustine, St. Paul, the prophets, and the Torah. And it is the view that Martin Luther is trying to fight for and reaffirm in the context of his time. Very briefly, then, when Luther talks about freedom, we have to understand this conversation in light of church law and church doctrine related to external works of righteousness. So how do we know that we are good? How do we know that we are earning God's favor? Well, the church gave a series of events, of pilgrimages, of endowments, of donations that one could make, of things to do. You could endow a mass, or you could do these good works, and then you would know, you would accrue this merit. You would have control over your behavior and be able to tick off a list of things that one can do before God. Now again, this is not just a Roman Catholic problem of the late Middle Ages. I think this is human nature. Protestants are just as guilty of this way of thinking as Roman Catholics or any other Christian or, quite frankly, person, right? Scripture says that this is a human problem, not merely limited to one particular religion or denomination. So Luther points out that yes, these things may be good in of themselves, pilgrimages, good works, caring for the poor, endowing the church with money to do the good works. These may be good in themselves, but when understood coram Deo, before God, these good works amount to really nothing in light of what God has done for us. And so again, we should have humility. We should do those good works, but approach them with a sense of humility, not as gaining credit or earning God's attention. And in fact, just the opposite can be true. And Luther points the danger there, that this is where these good works can become, if not done with the right intention, could become, in essence, evil or wrong if, and this is the important point here, if they lead to arrogance. If we say to ourselves, I've done this, I've done that, then therefore I have earned, God should love me, God owes me something, Luther says then you're in a very dangerous category. You're in a very dangerous place. So yes, these works are good, but if you do them for the wrong reasons, or if you do them in a way that is meant to lift you up and make you feel good about yourself, and only to that end, you are in very dangerous territory. And what Luther reminds us then is only that which is external to us. Ultimately, that which is external to us makes us righteous. And what is external? God's love and God's righteousness, God's goodness as revealed to us in the person and work of Jesus Christ. So this is that key paragraph in 26, that whatever can be done by the soul's effort is of no benefit when understood coram Deo, right, in light of our relationship with God. In light of our relationship with God, Luther reminds us, it is only God's love for us that ultimately matters, not the way we lift ourselves up. Think of that Tower of Babel. We're going to scale heaven with our good works. Luther says that's wrong. What's important to remember is the way that God has descended to us, that though God is above our human condition and above the world, nonetheless God empties himself, taking the form of a servant in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And it is that external word, that word of promise that comes from outside of us, which is the source and foundation of true Christian hope and true Christian freedom. Now, a little later, we'll get into some of the controversies that come with this point of view, because Luther is so emphatic of this coram Deo approach and takes a point of view that many find pessimistic. It would seem that Luther is denying the goodness or the importance of good works. And he comes toward the end of this treatise to circle back and make sure he's not misunderstood in that regard. Some have also found Luther guilty of a kind of predestinationism, right? That if humans have no freedom, then everything we do, from what we wear to eat for breakfast, right? Everything is predetermined by God. And later, Luther will explicitly reject that view in a dialogue with Erasmus and John Calvin. But here in these early days, predestination is not his concern. He wants us to understand where our righteousness consists as Christians, and our righteousness for Luther, for Paul, consists only in the goodness and grace and mercy of God's love through Jesus Christ. This then moves us to those paragraphs in 30 to 33, where he then talks about the importance of faith. Faith here is not a work, very important. Faith is trust. Trust in what? Trust in the goodness and mercy of God. True righteousness consists not in what we do, but in what God does for us. And the only human response to that, ultimately, is to surrender to the goodness of God who loves us and declares it's not what we do, but what God does for us. So he then moves to unpack the nature of faith in paragraphs 34 to 51. And that's what I'd like us to look at next week. Paragraphs 34 to 51, we'll talk about the nature of Scripture and the three powers of faith. Until then, God bless, have a wonderful week, and we'll see you then.